Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. We'll begin in a few minutes.
Sounds good, thanks.
We're going to begin in just 1 minute. Good morning, and thank you for joining the webinar, Netting Our Goals, How Can Social and Behavior Change Programs Maximize Net Use, Longevity, and Access. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started. All participants are going to be muted throughout the presentations and through the Q&A. If you have any questions throughout the presentations, please put them in the Q&A box, not in the chat, preferably. If there are any technical issues, you're having trouble hearing or have a question about something with the function of the webinar, you can put that in the chat box and we'll get to you right away. We won't be answering any questions until the end of all the presentations, but feel free to ask those questions in the Q&A box throughout, and we'll be moderating a Q&A section at the end. Now I'm going to hand it over to the moderator. John Dickerson is moderating today. He's a senior malaria technical advisor for the U.S. President's Malaria Initiative. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Rebecca, and welcome everybody. I hope you're all doing well. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. As Rebecca said, I'm Don Dickerson, a senior malaria technical advisor for the President's Malaria Initiative, PMI. Welcome to this webinar on insights from the VectorWorks project's new toolkit for social and behavior change for ITNs. VectorWorks is a 5-year USAID-funded global project to increase access to and use of insecticide-treated mosquito nets. For the past 4.5 years, PMI has supported VectorWorks to expand on the strong and successful work of the Networks project to strategically apply and use research findings to increase access to and use of nets. Net use tends to be the main emphasis of net-related social and behavior change programs. However, as VectorWorks has shown in numerous publications, webinars, and other fora, ITN use is generally high among those individuals with access to an ITN. But the work of SBC programs is far from over. Major gaps in net use remain in various countries, and nets wear out far faster than they are being replaced. Even when net distributions take place, many households are missed. Some countries are battling the specter of insecticide resistance with next-generation nets, and others struggle to find solutions for nets being misused for fishing and other purposes. Today's presenters will share new tools and insights for designing SBC strategies for nets. Our first presenter, Angela Acosta, will present the new social and behavior change for ITN's toolkit. This guide illustrates other dimensions of ITN use, such as ITN acquisition, care, outdoor sleeping, repurposing, and seasonal variation that may help SBC programs reinvigorate their approach and optimize ITN use and access. Our second presenter, Dr. Hannah Conker, will talk about net use, particularly how and where to focus net use messaging for efficient use for resources. Finally, Sean Blofus will share findings from several net durability monitoring activities and talk about the implications for social and behavior change. Net durability is a vital area for SBC where we could use more emphasis as community, particularly since families do not often have control over when to get a new net. Ensuring the nets they do have last as long as possible is a place where SBC has been proven to be effective. Each speaker will have about 20 minutes to present, and we will have 20 minutes at the end to respond to comments and questions. One other housekeeping note, this web is being recorded, and we will make available the recording as well as the presentations and the full document about social and behavior change for ITNs at the conclusion of this session. Without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our first presenter, Angela Acosta. Angela is a senior program officer at the Johns Hopkins Center for Communication Programs, working on the PMI VectorWorks project and supports malaria activities also under Breakthrough Action. Angela?
Thank you, Don. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening. My name is Angela Acosta, a Senior Program Officer with the PMI VectorWorks project. Today, I will share a, just give me a second here. I think there's a lag in the, there we go. Today, I will share some new tools for new frontiers in SBC for ITNs, or social and behavior change for ITNs. Since 2000, more than 1.7 billion insecticide-treated nets have been distributed. Current trends suggest that they will continue to remain a vital malaria control intervention in the years to come. Therefore, understanding how social and behavior change programs can strategically support how nets are rolled out and used will be a continuing task for members of the malaria community. Social and behavior change is defined as the coordinated use of a range of approaches to achieve individual and collective behavior change. While most SBC activities rely on communication-based approaches such as mass and social media and interpersonal communication, non-communication-based approaches informed by behavioral economics and design thinking are increasingly being incorporated as well. As Don has mentioned, there are new and underutilized frontiers in social and behavior change for nets. We have learned, for example, that promoting net care can extend how long nets last in households, potentially resulting in millions of dollars saved in procurement, as well as extending the duration of protection that families receive. In the past 10 years, we have also refined our understanding of how to do social and behavior change for different kinds of net distributions. Today, we are launching a new resource called Social and Behavior Change for Insecticide-Treated Nets. This toolkit provides implementers with a comprehensive one-stop shop on ITNs. By all aspects, I mean all aspects. It is pretty comprehensive. This toolkit addresses the frontiers mentioned above and many others. It includes strategy design for net use and its various aspects, such as seasonality, net preferences, and outdoor sleeping, among others, net care, net misuse, disposal, and repurposing, as well as SBC for different methods of net distribution. The guide also covers SBC for various situational contexts, such as low transmission settings, nets in combination with indoor residual spraying, and pyrethroid resistance and next generation nets. The Social and Behavior Change for Insecticide-Treated Nets toolkit synthesizes what we have learned from decades of research and experience on ITNs. It summarizes key findings and shares examples from multiple countries. It also includes tools to help facilitate planning and decision-making so SBC programs can optimize net use, longevity, and access. In the next few slides, I will share a preview of some of the key insights and tools from this toolkit. To fully understand the breadth of how SBC can be used to optimize net use, access, and longevity, we must first begin by identifying the range of behaviors involved. From this figure, the first of a few planning tools in the toolkit, you will see that there are more behaviors than just net use. We will start with the left-hand side, on the net acquisition side. As obvious as it may seem, access to an ITN is the primary determinant of ITN use. Multiple surveys have shown that having enough ITNs for the household size is the most important predictor of net use, as Hannah Conqueror, my colleague, will demonstrate later. From a behavioral perspective, ITN access can be improved by using SBC, social behavior change, to boost net acquisition behaviors. Social and behavior change can be used to encourage households to register during mass campaigns, promote ANC and immunization service utilization so that women and children can get nets from these services, stimulating demand for our nets where community distribution programs are in place, and promoting the purchase of ITNs where applicable. After a household member has access to a net, net use becomes the primary behavior of interest. Ideally, we would like households to use a net throughout the year and use whatever nets they have, regardless of shape or color, and to use them wherever they are sleeping, whether indoors or outdoors. I will go into that in a little bit more detail later. As nets age, they become worn and torn from use, necessitating good net care. Households should tie up the net or fold it when not in use to keep it away from dirt or from snagging objects, from being destroyed by children who are playing with the net, and to keep it away from rodents. Nets need to be handled carefully and to be washed in a basin with gentle soap, dried in the shade, and mended when holes begin to appear. Because households generally have few options for replacing their nets until the next mass campaign, keeping nets functional for as long as possible allows households to maximize malaria protection in circumstances where they cannot control access to new nets. As nets get dirty and torn, households may consider replacing them or reusing them for other purposes. Net acquisition behavior will become relevant again, and questions may arise as to the appropriate uses for old nets. Households repurpose all kinds of home goods when they break or disintegrate, and nets are no exception. Local officials may be called to respond to instances of ITNs being used for fishing or gardening. In these situations, clear yet pragmatic messaging about beneficial, neutral, and harmful uses for old nets will be key. In the toolkit, we provide examples of SBC activities that have been or can be used to promote each of these behaviors. Okay. The next tool we would like to feature is this set of decision trees or dashboard. This dashboard outlines how available data can be used to assess 4 areas of an ITN program: net acquisition, net use, net care, and residual transmission. This is based on the idea that net SBC strategy should be tailored to the context. For each topic area, a decision tree gives guidance on SBC activities or additional research needs, if any, based on where a country, province, or district stands on the key metric. And so we outlined the key metrics at the top of each of those boxes. Programs can choose to assess 1, 2, 3, or all 4 areas, depending on the data available. The resulting combination of actions can be used to guide ITN SBC strategies. For example, under Area 1, Access, we blend our understanding of how net distribution programs and SBC programs interact. If survey data shows high rates of population access to ITNs, only routine SBC to promote net acquisition through current existing distribution methods may be needed. However, if access rates are low, then malaria programs will need to shift to mass campaigns, and with it, SBC to boost registration. In 2016, we published an analysis of 14 mass campaigns, and we found that being registered was the most important determinant of whether households received a net from that campaign. My colleagues Hannah and Sean will go into more details on areas 2 and 3 in their presentations. So now I will go into more detail on SBC for net acquisition, or for obtaining nets through different distribution methods. Another tool available in this toolkit is this figure, which illustrates how messages can be timed. So first, let's consider that a comprehensive SBC strategy for nets will have both continuous and discrete elements. Continuous SBC activities will include promoting net use and care throughout the year. If routine distribution through antenatal care and EPI or immunization services exists, messaging to promote these services should also be ongoing. There can also be discrete activities, so not as opposed to continuous. There can also be discrete activities regarding SBC for nets. So these can be related to the mass campaigns, such as registration, school distribution, which usually occurs about once a year and during 1 week period in a year. And where needed, communication around net use, repurposing, or disposal. In this figure, the SBC program being portrayed is that in a setting in a country where there's a 3 yearly mass campaign, as well as ongoing routine distribution through ANC and EPI. So at the top on orange, you will see that we're talking about the mass distribution, like the population with access to an ITN. So when the population access is low and a country starts to conduct a mass distribution campaign, the country is encourages high participation in the campaign by promoting campaign registration. And then net use SBC would start just before the dry season. Similarly, SBC promoting net use SBC starts just before the rainy season. SBC promoting net use during the dry season launches before that season begins. And finally, ANC and EPI distribution and net care messaging runs throughout. This basically shows how the behaviors being promoted will vary depending on where the country or province or district is in the mass distribution cycle, the rainy or dry season, and how old the net may be. Okay. So in the preceding figure, we showed a common scenario where a country uses a combination of mass distribution and routine distribution through ANC and EPI. Some countries also implement a once annual school distribution, while others distribute nets to community agents all year. These types of distribution can be combined with mass distribution and routine distribution, and different countries do it in different ways. So the key for us as SBC community members is how do we approach SBC for these different types of distribution methods, and especially when there are multiple methods being conducted in a given context. First of all, SBC for all the distribution methods should use the same umbrella brand and encourage similar things such as consistent net use, net care, beneficial repurposing, and generally net acquisition. But how the net acquisition messages are framed should be specific to who exactly is eligible for which channel and how those persons should obtain a net. There are also some distribution-specific customizations. For ANC and EPI, we would also want to encourage service utilization. For school distribution, we would want to explain that the net is for the household to assign to a user as they see fit, and it's not just for the student who received the net at school. Community distribution systems tend to have multiple criteria, such as having a pregnant woman, a child under 5 in the household, a net 2 damage to be used, or a household having just moved to the area. These criteria should be clearly articulated so that there's no confusion about who's eligible or not. So a note on the kinds of channels that you can use for different distribution methods. The usual range of channels have been used. These can include mass media and community leaders for all of these channels. But I think it's important to leverage the unique opportunities for interpersonal communication available through that distribution, since that point of contact is already being made. So this means, for example, healthcare workers should be leveraged for interpersonal communication opportunities during routine distribution. The same for community volunteers for mass and community distribution, and teachers for school distribution. In the social and behavior change for ITN's toolkit, we provide links to different materials, messages, and activities that different countries have used for each of these types of distribution. So now I'm going to speak about net use for different kinds of contexts that are very maybe small scale or very, very specific. So on outdoor sleeping, there's a small body of evidence showing that ITN protection can often be challenging or unfeasible. People may be exposed to mosquito bites when they're socializing outdoors or working. This can apply, for example, to night watchmen or to fishermen or pastoralists watching their herds. People can also be exposed to mosquito bites when conducting household chores. In addition to nighttime activities or early evening, early morning activities, outdoor sleeping is common in some areas. This can happen routinely, such as sleeping outside during the warm season in the compound, or during large-scale events, such as during weddings or funerals. ITN use can be challenging in these contexts because of the logistical and social barriers to outdoor sleeping. However, we should recognize that SBC can play a role in changing social norms and in changing perceived barriers to net use. In the toolkit, we show examples of people having made minor modifications so that they can sleep outdoors. For example, by rigging poles in the ground in Ghana, or by creating community nets where children can sleep outdoors in groups, as in Kebbi State, Nigeria. SBC planners must also recognize that net use is not always feasible for all individuals during all nights of the year. Different types of formative research may be deployed to identify ways to use ITN outdoors or in group settings. Where ITN use is not feasible, planners might wish to encourage alternative bite prevention tools such as repellents or treated clothing, but that is kind of beyond the scope of this toolkit. It is also important, though, to kind of understand better what the context for transmission may be. Integrating data on human behavior along with mosquito behavior can be useful in prioritizing specific times, places, and groups that are at greatest risk. So next is next generation nets. To combat the rise in resistance to pyrethroid nets, which is the most common net distributed to date, there have been new chemical formulations that are being imbued into nets. And these nets are called next generation nets. There's one formulation called pyrethroid with synergistic pyperenyl butoxide, or PBO. That's the red box in the middle. That type of net increases the susceptibility of mosquitoes to pyrethroid insecticides. There's a new type of net called G2, which uses chlorophenapyr, which is a new class of insecticide that disrupts mosquitoes' ability to produce energy. Next generation nets have demonstrated effectiveness in areas with prevalent pyrethroid resistance, but they're currently only being distributed in a limited basis, and we don't yet have enough evidence on the best SBC approaches to use. So far, countries distributing next generation nets are not creating NGN-specific SBC messaging, and there are several reasons for this. So, So there are several reasons for this. There are several risks associated with crafting social behavior change materials for just next generation nets. So for example, there may be underlying factors like political or religious sensitivities that may mean that issuing a different net to a certain area may be seen as favoring a group over another. There's also the risk of creating distrust and ultimately lower rates of use. Long-standing concerns about side effects such as fertility linger in some areas and may be reignited in those areas that are aware that they're using the current pyrethroid-only nets. Lastly, the expected benefits of developing and disseminating social and behavior change materials just for next-generation nets may not outweigh the time and cost involved. So in the toolkit, we outline a few considerations for countries to think about before they develop materials for next generation nets. So for example, are there any unique characteristics of the next generation net that would require special messaging? Would the messaging for next generation nets conflict with messagings for pyrethroid only nets? And will households have both types of nets, and how will you then prevent confusion or distrust? So as I mentioned earlier, this is an area that's still very new, and as more and more countries are implementing the distribution of next generation nets, it's important that we as a malaria community share lessons from our communication activities. So repurposing and net misuse. Households have demonstrated countless nets to repurpose old ITNs. Old nets can be repurposed in beneficial ways, ways that grant protection from mosquitoes, and ways that do not grant protection from mosquitoes. This decision tree, also from the SBC toolkit, illustrates when nets can and cannot be repurposed and for what beneficial uses. So generally, households should continue to maintain and use their nets for as long as possible and follow the recommendations for net care to prolong the useful life of nets. After a net is no longer useful for sleeping, beneficial repurposing should be encouraged. This can include turning old nets into curtains, screens, or to block open eaves. Neutral repurposing of expired nets, such as to protect crops, is acceptable. But new net should never be repurposed. It's not acceptable. And fishing with any net is never acceptable. Misuse of nets for fishing is an emerging topic, especially in waterside communities. It not only defeats the public health purpose of providing protection from malaria, but it can also have negative environmental consequences, such as rapidly depleting fish stocks. Studies have shown that the drivers of mosquito net misuse are a combination of a struggling economy and food insecurity. There are opportunities for SBC, which can include community policing and raising awareness about the impact of net misuse on people's long-term security and livelihood, but these should be paired in ways that identify households at high risk who may need additional livelihood support. However, we should note that although misuse can be sensationalized in the media and that it can sometimes be common in a cluster of communities, there's no indication that widespread misuse is occurring across Africa. Low transmission settings. The World Health Organization recommends high level of vector control with nets or IRS as the burden of malaria declines. They say that the scale back of vector control in low transmission and very low transmission settings could result in malaria resurgence. So SBC programs in low transmission areas should consider how declining transmission will affect perceptions of malaria risk and whether people will still think that there's a need for continuing to use nets. Some strategies SBC programs could adopt may include emphasizing the non-malaria benefits of nets. This can include a good night's sleep or better performance at work or school. Maintaining a sense of risk. One way to maintain vigilance in net use is to remind people that malaria is always present and that the risk could be severe. This should be balanced with messaging about efficacy, that ITN use is feasible in most situations and it is effective. A qualitative study in Zanzibar found that residents understood that malaria transmission rates had declined, but they still feared getting malaria and they valued ITN use as a result. So we have some indication that people can understand that risk can remain even when perceptions of risk can remain even as actual transmission declines. But there's still some work that we as SBC programmers can do to maintain that continuing sense of risk. Another way might be to sustain the motivation of progress towards a shared goal of elimination. In 2017, Zambia rebranded its malaria SBC activities in line with a new political commitment to elimination. So they branded their malaria SBC activities as Malaria Free Zambia, Malaria Ends With Me. And this unites all of the activities of the public and private sector partners. And at the village level, it makes malaria activities seem like they're part of a broader national initiative, lending credibility and hopefully personal buy-in into sustaining malaria prevention behaviors. Finally, more attention would be needed to be paid to mobile groups. Because they often lack access to services, they are at higher risk of contracting malaria and of bringing malaria back to low transmission areas. SBC programs have used positive deviance to identify novel supporting behaviors. For example, one of these behaviors was a wife putting a net into her husband's bag before he goes into the forest. Other SBC programs have successfully worked with mobile outreach workers and organized net lending programs with employers of mobile and migrant populations. So in the interest of time, I'm gonna jump to the last slide, which is resources. I will pause here, and I hope this has given you a good idea of the range of topics covered by the toolkit, and that you would consider referring to the toolkit when planning future programs. You'll be able to find it on the PMI and Vectorworks website. It is also available on the Springboard for SBC, if you're a member. It's a discussion forum for all things SBC. If you're not a member, you will need to sign it first and join the malaria group in order to access the guide and the conversation around the guide there. It will also be available on the Compass for SBC website, which is an online repository of SBC resources. And we will send out the toolkit after this webinar. The toolkit covers subject matter related to ITNs. However, it shouldn't be used alone. It would be best to use this toolkit in combination with other best practices within SBC. So here in the slide, I've included 3 useful resources. The strategic framework elucidates the methodology for developing and implementing SBC strategies for malaria and generating the political buy-in for them. The indicator guide provides guidance on monitoring and evaluation, as well as potential standard indicators and survey questions. And the checklist is a handy tool to keep at hand to ensure the SBC program is of high quality. There are more resources in the resource section of this toolkit. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. That was a helpful introduction to the toolkit and decision tree and other management tools it offers. Now I would like to introduce our second presenter. Dr. Hannah Conker is the project director of the PMI Vectorworks projects at the Johns Hopkins Center for Communication Programs. She will present what the toolkit has to offer in terms of the evidence base for understanding ITN use behaviors. That is, who uses ITNs when they have access to one in their household. Welcome, Hannah.
Thanks, Don. Welcome, everybody. It's nice to be back with you. So in my section, I'll try and give an overview of all of the data that we've established on all these questions that we use to inform our SBC programming. The toolkit compiles a lot of the data as up to date as we are able to make it. And it's important that as SBC professionals, we always want to make sure that we're considering and using all the available data. And so our goal here at Vectorworks has been to gather that evidence, establish that evidence, and then make it available for everyone else to use to inform their programming. So as Angela stated, I'll be talking mainly here about area 2 in terms of how we use the use to access ratio to categorize groups and places and times of year, and focus our efforts less on the places where things are pretty good in green, where the use access ratio is over 80, but more on the places where we have more problems. So just as a reminder for everybody, some of you have heard this several times and others are hearing it for the first time. The main net use indicator that we use to inform our SBC programming is the ratio of ITN use to ITN access. So this is the proportion of the population using a net among those who could use a net. We can't talk about behaviors for people who don't have a net to use because they have a different problem. So the ITN use to access ratio tells us about the culture of net use in a given population. Above a ratio of 0.8, which we can think of as about 80%, the culture of net use is strong for whatever time of year that survey was done, whatever geographic area you're looking at. And a thing to note as well is that above a ratio of 1.0, that just means that more than 2 people on average are sharing a net. So you might have a couple kids and a mom or several kids under a net in places where that ratio is above 1. All of this is currently detailed in the ITN Access and Use Report, which is available at www.vectorworks.org. We are posting later today an updated version with some updated maps, and we do that periodically as new data sets are released from DHS program, whether those are DHS or MIS surveys. We are also in the process of making a website version of this so that folks can go and look just at their particular country and get a lot of different information. So what does this all mean? We're looking at who is using a net, who is not using a net, where are people using a net, where are people not using nets when they have them. And so across over 90 MIS and DHS surveys, we've looked at the key determinants of use. And in no particular order, they are the season of data collection, the region within the country that is being surveyed, urban and rural residents, wealth quintile, age of the individual, and sex. And all of these determinants are related to perceived malaria risk, and I'll go through why. So what we know is that, first of all, in terms of who is using a net or not, when households or communities don't have enough ITNs for everybody, children under 5 and women of reproductive age are using ITNs at the highest rates. So these groups are vulnerable. We have told people that they are vulnerable. People recognize that they are vulnerable, and therefore they are prioritized when there aren't enough nets in the household. After that, it tends to be adult men, and then in kind of last place, we have our school-age children. This is illustrated in these many graphs. As we go through, I'm just pointing out that we'll have blocks of very tiny graphs for everybody to look at later on your own in a computer screen where you can blow up the graph to your particular country. But to explain the graph, I'm using this example from the most recent DHS survey to be released, which has been in 2018. In the top 2 lines, we've got women in purple and men in gray, and the solid lines here are among households that have enough nets for all of their household members. So we can see that the proportion of the population that used an ITN the previous night is really quite high in this particular survey for both men and women, with a slight boost for women over adult men in the age groups that are down here, so 20 to 30-ish. When households don't have enough nets, they have at least one, but not enough for 1 for 2 people. These are our dotted lines down here. We still see that, again, the highest priority are 0 to 5-year-olds and are women of reproductive age here in the purple dashed line. We have this dip here in boys, age 10 to 15, 15 to 20. These are adult men who are maybe not sleeping under their nets quite as much. And the school age bracket here dipping down in relation to the younger kids. So frankly, this is the pattern that we see in all of the countries. The lines here kind of move up and down the graph, somewhat depending on the overall underlying level of population access within the country, and as well as some perceived risk. So Zimbabwe is down here, not doing so great. This is a graph just to illustrate in terms of who, again, is using or not using. We're looking at the wealthiest wealth quintile versus the poorest wealth quintile. And I think this is just, I've got a bar at the top here blocking my view of the title. But in surveys after 2010, so in the universal coverage era, we're looking at the odds of ITN use among those with access, controlling for the month of the survey, the region, residence, which is urban rural, and access to ITN. Overall, among these countries, there's about a 20% reduced odds of net use among the wealthiest households, people in the wealthiest households, compared to the poorest households. And so you'll see this can vary a little bit by country, but also even within a country, depending on the survey that was done. But overall, we do see relatively significant decline in net use among the wealthiest. And our hypothesis is that this has to do with the fact that they have other ways to protect themselves or feel that they're less at risk. Further illustrating this, we have a set of graphs here. On the y-axis, we're looking at ITN use among those with access, so this culture of net use. On the x-axis is the underlying level of malaria parasitemia, so the percent of children 6 to 59 months that are RDT positive within that particular subgroup. Now, in Ghana and Nigeria, we have this really strong, relatively linear relationship where the poorest folks that live in the sort of most rural areas are using their nets really well at about 80% use among those with access. And they have the highest levels of parasitemia. They're living in the environments where there's a lot of malaria. As you get richer, you get less malaria and you use your net less. Now, this is not to say that using a net makes you have high parasitemia, but rather that there's some relationship and perception here that as the malaria risk goes down, you may be less motivated to use that net. Now, Ghana and Nigeria are two sort of examples where there is this nice relationship here. However, when we look at other countries, we don't always see the same thing. In DRC, for example, almost everybody is using their net most of the time. So above 80% use among those with access, regardless of the level of malaria parasitemia in their particular area. In Tanzania, we've got a sort of relationship here, but most people have, so the richest are sort of in this low parasitemia area. They're still using their nets here. This is sort of urban wealth quintiles. And then in the rural wealth quintiles, there's a little bit of a drop off in the net use as parasitemia goes up, which we're still exploring a little bit. So for those of you with really good eyesight or big enough screens that you can blow this up, this is in the toolkit, and you can go and check out your own country when you have time. So next, we want to look at where people are using their nets. So after we look at who, which wealth quintiles, which age groups, which gender, which sex, we want to look at where. And so the maps that we provide with the ITN use and access report at vectorworks.org, we have our overall map of Africa. You can see a lot of it is green, especially here in the middle in DRC, Mozambique here, Madagascar, and then there's some red bits in Namibia, Zimbabwe, and portions of other nations. We also blow these up. We have them provided for each country where we have GIS data available in that DHS or MIS. And so even within a country, you can see a little bit more granularity where the trouble spots are. And obviously in Mozambique, southern Mozambique has less malaria than northern Mozambique. So again, the perception of risk helps to draw people towards that net use behavior. In Ghana, for example, this dark spot here is Accra. This little dark spot here is Takoradi. Up here we have Tamale, and up here we have very hot and dry weather. So you can see a little bit how the urban and rural dichotomies are operating. You can help with the maps to gauge exactly where you want to focus some of your ACC efforts, SBC efforts. There we go. All right. So the thing I also want to talk about is when people are using their nets. And by when, I mean which time of year. And trying to advance the slides. Here we go. So this is really quite recent research that we've done looking at patterns of rainfall throughout different months of the year in different zones of sub-Saharan Africa. We've taken all of the available GHS and MIS data sets that have GIS data, pulled them together, and then constructed these zones, which are based on existing climate typologies from Köppen climate classifications, and then also overlaying what their rainfall pattern looks like. So for example, here in Senegal and Mali and northern Nigeria, the rainfall pattern peaks in sort of June, July. Down here in the southern hemisphere of southern part of Africa, that relationship is sort of inverse. So you have those peaks in December and January. And then along the equator in this area and span, you've got this bimodal rainfall pattern here. So you've got two peak rainfalls. So we've divided these and color-coded them into 9 different sort of rainfall typologies. And the goal is to put enough places together over the different surveys and the different years of the surveys that have been done to get data for a full year's worth of net use and rainfall. So our keyword inside. What that looks like is, for example, let's look at the arid north. So the orange zone here in the upper left is what we're talking about here with the orange dots on the map. So we've plotted 2 years worth of data. It's the same data for each year, but just to get a sense of the periodicity of this. The shaded area is the average rainfall for that zone, just taken on average. So you've got this peak in June, July, you've got dry season in December, February, it gets hot, here's temperature, and you've got a rainy season here. ITN use among those with access follows the rainfall. And you have these big increases as the rain starts to fall and then afterwards. And then you've got these big dips in the dry season. Now, none of this is very new, but if you've been looking at net use behavior across different places in Africa, we're starting to see different patterns in different types of climate zones. For example, here in the tropical equatorial, so much of the top half of DRC, Uganda, and parts of Kenya here, rainfall is relatively steady. There's a little dip here, but there's always some rain. And we can see as a corollary, the use of ITNs throughout the year is also relatively steady. This is true not only for the tropical equatorial zone, but also for Rwanda, Burundi, et cetera, in the temperate equatorial zone where things aren't quite as hot. So the more seasonal patterns of rainfall we have, the greater the variation in the seasonal net use patterns. Now, this is interesting, but what we really want to do is recognize whether this has anything to do with malaria transmission. And I'll just point out that the lag between the peak ITN use and the peak rainfall is about 1 to 3 months, which matches up nicely with mosquito breeding life cycle timing. So, as an example, here is Nigeria, and we do have these graphs for all the countries if you want to blow them up on your own. So in Nigeria, for example, this red shaded area in each of the graphs is the average malaria transmission season. We've taken this from the Mara maps. So we've got here Nigeria's arid north zone. We have this dip, this classic dip of net use as it's dry and hot. There aren't really any mosquitoes. And then it goes up as the rains start going. And it's high throughout most of that transmission season. In the tropical bimodal north, which in Nigeria is sort of the southern bit, Lagos, et cetera, we have overall sort of lower net use behaviors, but we still have that peak with the rains coming up and a little bit of variation here as the rain starts to drop off. However, the malaria season is much longer in this zone because the rainfall in the shaded area is also happening over more of the year. Right, so the take-home points. We think that the patterns strongly indicate that ITN use is catalyzed by the emergence and presence of mosquitoes because of the lags between the peak rain and the peak ITN use. And we suspect that this is probably related to perceived risk of malaria, which is driven itself by perceived mosquito density. So we want to consider in our SBC programming whether the country has a significant seasonal challenge with ITN use. Then does that net season, the net use season and the malaria season, do they coincide perfectly? Are there places where that overlap is dangerous for people where they're not using their nets yet, but malaria transmission is booming? And then look at ways to boost that use in targeted months, not only the dry season, but maybe especially that shoulder season where the risk is higher. I am going to skip over the preferences stuff for the sake of time, but just to let you know that we have updated this as of just 1 or 2 months ago. So we include the data that is available for reported color preferences for ITNs. It is not very much, I will just say that. And the percentage of nets that are used the previous night according to their color, which is not also that much. We're also starting to look a little bit at net textile. And programmatically, there's not much use in the use of nets by different textile, but when you control for other factors, there starts to be a 30% reduced odds of using polyethylene nets compared to polyester nets, which I think is important to explore. All right, there's also a lot of social and psychological determinants. These vary by country, and again, for the sake of time and allowing Sean to get going, I will jump over this, but it's important to look very closely at the social psychological determinants in addition to all of the structural and background demographic factors that are very important. We also want to just make sure we're looking at all the data. So putting all of this together in the sake of Ghana, we get a sense that it's higher wealth quintile households, that we have a gap in terms of the data for seasonal net use because Ghana's only done surveys in these few months of the year. And we can assess the age and gender or age and sex patterns of net use over here. And there we go. So I will head back to Don and we'll continue.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. The evidence that we have around ITN use among people who have access to an ITN is really important to guide programs to the right times and places to focus ITN SBC activities. Now I would like to introduce our third presenter. Sean Blaufus is a program officer at Johns Hopkins Center for Communication Programs, working on the PMI VectorWorks project as well as Breakthrough Action. He will present on how to use early findings from durability monitoring activities to inform SBC in order to help prolong the useful life of nets. Welcome, Sean.
Thank you, Don. All right, I'd like to get started by revisiting the SBC decision tree that was first introduced by Angela and revisited by Hannah. Area 1, we looked at access to ITNs and making sure that distribution SBC was in a good place to ensure that a large part of the at-risk population had a net. In Area 2, we looked at use of ITNs and potential issues or things to look at in our data to ensure that those who have access to a net are able to use a net. I want to focus on Area 3, which is the durability of those nets. Because mass campaigns are still the dominant distribution channel, and mass campaigns typically occur every 3 years, we need to introduce the element of time and making sure that our nets are staying in usable condition for as long a period as possible for as high a proportion of the population. All right. So this schematic here sort of introduces the same areas, but it kind of shows the impact overall on a net strategy in a country. So if we start with a target population at 100%, and you look down the different steps through the distribution efficiency, the net use among the population who has access, and finally the net durability, you see overall there's a reduced population that has the potential to use a net by taking away the percent that is missing from each block. So in this example, you can see that 88% of the target population received a net. Among that 88% of those who received a net, only 90% are currently using a net. And at this period in time, or this point in time, 78% of those who have chosen to use a net actually have a net that's in serviceable condition. And on the bottom in yellow, you can see the sort of cumulative effect that this has. So at a given point in time from our target population, we might have something approximating 60% of potential users using a net. And this varies depending on where in the distribution cycle we are. And an interesting question is sort of that last block, net durability. How much can it vary and how much can it impact our net programs? These are two examples from current Vectorworks durability monitoring studies after 24 months. And in Site A, we find that 91% of the ITN distributed from a recent mass campaign were still available in the household that they were intended for in serviceable condition. I'll talk a little bit more later about what serviceable condition means, but in a basic sense, it means that it's still effective for malaria control and prevention. We can contrast this with Site B, which is another real site where only 33% of nets are available in serviceable condition after 24 months. This is a gap of 58%, and we find that sites throughout our 8 ongoing studies sort of fall in this range. But as you can see, this can have a tremendous impact on your net strategy and how effective it's going to be in protecting your population across a 3-year distribution cycle. If we think about net durability from a global perspective, there are really 3 main areas where we potentially could see an area for increased durability. The first in orange is the manufacturing. So we're talking about the actual textile strength, the material, and also the knitting pattern. The second is the net environment. And less than the local ecology, we're more talking about the household environment where the net might be used. And the third and final one is net care, sort of the household behaviors that can impact the longevity of a net. Now, if we look at the bottom, when we look at the potential inputs that are needed to potentially increase durability through these different methods, we can see that the first two, both the manufacturing and the net environment, require either large, significant investment or sort of a larger scale economic development to probably make large scale differences in net durability. Net care, on the other hand, has proven to be able to be influenced by effective SBC programs. I'm going to now look at a specific study from Nigeria conducted by my colleagues under the Networks project, which was the predecessor to PMI Vectorworks, that used the control intervention design in Nasarawa state, 2 different parts of the state, to look at what the exposure to SBC might mean for net care and repair following the 2010 mass campaign. So as part of this study, which was housed within a larger multi-site durability study in Nigeria, after 18 months after the distribution, a baseline survey was conducted, and then in the next 2 years, 2 different exposure periods to a multi-channel net care and repair SBC campaign were implemented in the intervention zone. After slightly more than 3 years, they came back to look at the results. So first, I want to introduce the concept of net care before we look at this diagram. There are a series of questions that are asked in durability studies that are scored on a Likert scale, where -2 represents the attitude that is the least net durability friendly, and +2 represents the score that is assigned to the most positive or the desired outcome for net behavior related to durability. On the left-hand side of the screen, we're looking at the proportion of campaign nets in serviceable condition according to the overall net care attitude. As you can see, there is a nice relationship between higher net care attitudes and both the proportion of campaign nets in serviceable condition after more than 3 years, and also the proportion of campaign nets that had observed repairs. On the right-hand screen of the screen, we can see the relationship between the number of sources cited by households and the number of messages they were able to recall, and the number of care actions they were able to cite. You can see a really nice dose-response relationship here, which is what we'd hope to see from an SBC program. Moving forward and looking at net survival, both by message recall and by the net care attitude, we can see that in both diagrams, there is a significant difference among those who have a positive care and repair attitude towards nets versus those who have a negative care and repair attitude, or less than 0. This is on the left-hand side. And just to explain these graphs a little bit, each line, sort of, if you find the red line, for instance, that kind of traces the theoretical net decay curve for nets that are supposed to last 2 years, and the green line, where you see the care and repair attitude for those nets, for those households with a positive attitude, that is in relation to nets that are expected to have about a 3-year lifespan. And these have been developed and validated with durability studies for more than 10 years now. On the right-hand side, we'll see the effect that message recall has on net survival. And you can see again that those households that were able to recall messages had a significantly higher likelihood of having a serviceable net in their household after more than 3 years in Nasarawa State, Nigeria. So looking at this and looking at some of the specific attitudes that are likely to correlate with having a net in serviceable condition after more than 3 years, we'll find the top 2 here in this small table on the left. The first one is, there are actions I can take to make nets last long. And the second one is, a repaired net is still effective against mosquitoes. And when we hear these things, something that came to our mind was sort of the extended parallel process model for 2 simple things. We're looking at the efficacy. So if we think about, there are actions I can take to make nets last long, people have the belief that they have the self-efficacy to take care of their net and ensure that it lasts for a long time. And the second net is, a repair net is still effective against mosquitoes. So this is saying that the impact of the net against a perceived threat, in this instance malaria, is actually high, or when it is high, it is more likely to relate to nets that are more likely to be in serviceable condition. When we're talking about the efficacy, we're talking about not only the self-efficacy, which I described, but also the response efficacy, or the belief that people have in their net that it will actually prevent mosquito bites and potentially malaria. So if we plot sort of these different attitudes onto this 2x2 grid, you can see that we are aiming to push people towards the green square, where very positive net attitudes, that is, people both have the high threat perception, or the high impact, I guess, since we're talking about a prevention tool, and they have the efficacy to manage and keep their nets in good condition for a long period of time. Moving to ongoing studies supported by PMI VectorWorks. VectorWorks currently has 8 durability studies that have either recently been completed or are in follow-up. You can see the map here on the right-hand screen. 7 of them in sub-Saharan Africa and 1 in the greater Mekong area. Sort of the general study design, or the standard study design, is a baseline data collection after 6 months of the mass campaign, with annual follow-up through 3 years after distribution. During these surveys, or during these data collection periods, we are conducting household surveys and looking at a bunch of known durability factors, including net care, net handling, and the household environment. Talked a lot about the physical state of the net, but we're also looking at the insecticidal integrity as well. And here is a sample of the questions that we're asking to try and determine the net attitude of household during these ongoing durability studies in these 8 countries. And you'll see, if you look back or think back to the table that we just visited, that these are actually very similar to the questions that were asked as part of the Nigeria study under the Networks project. So again, we're looking at things that test the efficacy of the household to undertake net care and repair practices or have those behaviors, and also people's confidence in the net to protect them from malaria. And just to revisit this model roughly, we're looking again to push people from the red to the yellow and ultimately to the green, or from poor net care attitude scores to moderate scores, and eventually to very positive scores, or anything greater than 1, keeping in mind that the maximum score is 2.0. And I say roughly because 1.0 is sort of what we're using, and something that we've seen in settings where we do have higher durability, that there is a good correlation, but this might not need to be calibrated a bit. It might be 0.9, it might be 1.1. But I think for our purposes, it's a very useful measuring stick. So what other data are we collecting in the durability studies? A lot of information on things that can inform and be useful to SBC programs in countries. Information on net handling, net washing, including the soap used and the frequency, cooking and food storage in the sleeping space, net repairs, and the sleeping space environment. Now, some of these are more in line with net care, or what we think of as net care, and some of them are more in line with the sleeping space environment or the net environment, which may have some behavioral components as well that can be targeted. And the question comes up, do these behaviors vary as well? I think from this graph, where we're looking at 3 of these samples, the answer is yes. So the 3 things that we're looking at here in yellow are, did the household ever cook in the sleeping room? In orange, was the net found tied up or folded when hanging during the day? And in blue, when the net was last washed and dried, was it done on a fence or a bush or somewhere where it might be at risk of tear? Now, if we look at the Mozambique example on the far left, in Nampula, we can see that all 3 of these practices are sort of at a somewhat high level. And so we might want to consider this when we're crafting our next communications program or SBC campaign, and think about if there is a potential to reduce cooking in the sleeping space, or the net being tied up during the day. As you can see, the orange line is actually relatively high in quite a few countries and sites. So this seems to be pretty common across most settings, that the net is not being tied up or folded during the day. And this may be something that generally should be targeted. Yes. So in addition to this information, varying, but it's important to think about if we have access to this data for country programs, and if not, are there opportunities to get this information? And as a last slide here, I'd like to welcome everyone to go to durabilitymonitoring.org and sign up. If you put in a request, we will usually get back to you within 24 hours and grant access to people to view the tools and some of the information published here. We have links to existing literature on durability. Some reports will be published soon. And we have a whole host of tools and guidelines that can help either someone looking to implement a durability study, or to perhaps interpret some of the results from an ongoing durability study. With that, I'm finished. And Don, I send it back to you.
Thank you, Sean. That's an interesting use of another set of data to guide SBC for ITN use in our countries. I'm now going to move on to questions. We have about 20 minutes for questions. And I will read them and then pass them over to the presenters to respond to. So the first question that we had is from Bolatito Ainigba. The question is, during the LLIN distribution, immediate and process evaluation seeks to know how many of the new nets are hanging. If we encourage the continued use of old nets and keeping of new nets for later, the percentage use may be low as to give the impression that the campaign is not successful or FPC during campaign was not strong enough to encourage use. Are there any ways we can reflect this in a positive light after the campaign? Angela, if you would like to address that question.
Thank you, Don. Thank you, Dr. Tito, for this question. So the consensus statement that was approved or vetted by the Vector Control Working Group and the SBCC Working Group by their under rollback malaria did state that it's okay for households to store new nets and keep using their old ones as long as they're usable. So given that situation, what then happens if your metric is percentage of new nets that are hanging from the campaign? So I guess for me, I would consider, like, it sounds to me like the most important metric for whether the campaign was successful was A, if they received a net from the campaign. So that would be one important measure. And then two, just overall net use rates among those with access. Because one would expect that would be higher anyway, because the campaign would have filled gaps in access. So first of all, measure overall access as a campaign metric, and then also measure overall use, because you would hope that the messaging from the campaign and the whole kind of flurry of efforts around the campaign kind of like help stimulate the net use culture a little bit. So that would also lead to higher net use rates among those with access. And then the other thing I would consider is encouraging sharing. If we're seeing that a lot of families are hoarding nets and that there's still gaps from the mass campaign because many households were not registered or were not reached by the registration teams, I would consider promoting sharing of nets. If you have nets that you're not using, consider giving it to a relative or a friend who does not have access to a net. So those are some of my ideas. Perhaps my other colleagues would like to share some of theirs too, if they have any.
Hi, Angela. I'm happy to jump in here. So thank you for the question, Boletito. During the durability studies, we often find that sometimes up to 60 or 70% of nets are not being used immediately after the campaign. But within the next year, the older nets are sort of phased out and the new campaign nets are used. This is simply people rationing their resources usually, and over the course of a few months, the old nets will go and the new nets will become the ones that are used. I think that, as Angela sort of alluded to, we need to look at the overall access to nets. That's the most important thing, and particularly nets that are in good condition to protect families and households. And if we want to measure just the efficacy of the campaign, then we should look at the household, how many nets it should have received, and then how many nets did it actually receive, to make sure that there weren't too few distributed, or there weren't, in another circumstance, too many nets distributed. So I think that's really important. And if we're just looking to see how many of the new nets are used, especially when we have multiple campaigns on top of one another, then we're not going to get a very good picture from a post-campaign process evaluation.
Great, thank you both. Our second question is from Mohammed Shafiq, and the question is, in Southeast Asia, despite having many distributed LLIMs, many people don't use them because they are not appropriate sizes, height, width, etc. They rather prefer conventional nets, which are larger and appropriate to their family sizes. How should we address this issue? Are we developing our strategies based on their preferences? Can we negotiate with donor to buy these preferred nets? Hannah, I'll pass it over to you to begin.
Thanks, and thanks, Shafiq. It's nice to have this question. So I think we are seeing a lot of challenges with how to measure preferences and explicitly the impact of preferences on actual net use. And I agree that in Southeast Asia, there is a much stronger tendency towards using the conventional, untreated, very nice, very large, decorative nets that fit the beds that people are using, or the sleeping spaces that people are using a bit better than the sort of standard size LLINs. The guidance that we have and the evidence that we have, I would say, is is compiled, but as I kind of quickly jumped over in the presentation, we're basing this on somewhat limited surveys. So for example, Malawi has a few surveys, but then there's only a couple other countries that have actually asked this question. So the important thing to do when trying to assess the impact of preferences for nets of different types on use of those nets is to ask the household in the survey both what preferences they have, and then to also measure the characteristics of the nets in the household so that you can assess the impact in a directional way or an associative way within the data set. There is some recommendations from WHO and from PMI on this, and I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done and more data that needs to be gathered. One area where I have some concerns is just that in the way that we distribute nets in a mass campaign fashion, if we do this every 3 years, then we're essentially just replacing nets, and there's not, because of net deterioration and wear and tear, people don't have multiple types of nets to use within their household unless, as in Southeast Asia, they're buying them from the local market. So it's difficult to see in sub-Saharan Africa preferential use of particular types of nets just because, you know, nobody has both a conical and a rectangular one anymore, and so they're not using one. So from a purely mathematical sense, it's somewhat difficult to draw really strong programmatic conclusions from that. So I say, I mean, from our perspective at the project, I think we're trying to advise donors to take those decisions in the most rational way possible. But ultimately, it's up to the donors to draw that policy and to speak with countries and work with them to figure out how to further research this issue.
Thank you, Hannah. Our next question is from Anna Bowen. And the question is, are there any data getting at whether or which people who don't have nets or have poor access to nets actually don't want them? That is, maybe they received nets but had little intention of using them, so they got rid of them. Or does evidence suggest everyone wants them and would use them, but the primary problem is improving access? Some of your graphs on use given access by age and sex seem to answer this, but what if the school-age boys and young men in households without sufficient nets actually didn't want them and got rid of them? Understanding this would help refine messaging and interventions, of course. Hannah, if you could address that.
Sure. Thanks, Anna, for that question. Yeah, our school age net use challenge is a thorny one, and I would actually like to see some qualitative research in a few different areas, asking these school age children, especially the boys and the young adult men, what they feel is going on. My suspicion is that even when we have one net for 2 people in a household, it's not exactly enough, depending on the way that households are, you know, putting their children to sleep, or teenagers are maybe in and out of the household, or for example, in Mali, you have the boys' hut sort of away from the rest of the family once they hit puberty, because as we all know, puberty is a challenging time. But they may not have a setup within the household that allows them to share one net for every 2 people, especially as they go into puberty and adolescence. So that's a theory, and I think it's worth investigating further. We don't have a lot of survey data necessarily on the proportion of people who got rid of a net because they didn't want it in the first place. I think we have in the durability monitoring a list of reasons in the questionnaire about why particular nets were given away or discarded or whatever. But there's not a lot of, you know, I don't like it, so I'm going to give it away. What we do see anecdotally, and again, it's hard to measure in surveys because it's happening before the moment of the survey, at the moment of the campaigns in places like Ghana, for example, there may be people who aren't interested in coming to pick up the net in the first place. That may be because they are feeling less at risk, they are busy, they have some other mechanisms to protect themselves, it's not a priority for them, they don't tend to use it anyway, and so they're not, they're not acquiring that net in terms of the net acquisition behavior. They also may dislike the the polyethylene net, for example, that is being distributed in that particular distribution point. So I think there is some further work to do on how net preferences affect net uptake and net retention. But I don't get the sense from the data that we've reviewed, and it's been a lot of data, that it's just that young boys and adult men don't want the nets in the first place. I think it has more to do with where they're sleeping, how they're sleeping, where they are in evenings, and all of that thorny behavioral stuff.
Thank you, Hannah. The next question is from Zila, and this is, did the durability monitoring study confirm theoretical duration of the nets? Sean, if you could address that.
Absolutely. I think, so coming in, the theoretical duration of a net was supposed to be around 3 years, which is why we have campaigns about every 3 years. What we find is that there's a significant variation in how long nets last, depending on the behaviors practiced, the net environment, and possibly some things to do with seasonal use or what portion of the population is using a net. In the extreme best case scenario, nets are lasting more than 5 years, and that is in northern Nigeria. And so we have, after 3 years, more than 80% of nets are still in really good condition and are still very effective against for malaria control. On the other hand, there are other situations and other settings where this number is less than 3, sometimes significantly more or less than 3 years in particularly harsh environments. In terms of the insecticidal content, we've been doing bioassays with each round of follow-up to sort of confirm sort of the bioefficacy of the nets. And we find that in a lot of settings, after 3 years, still a significant proportion, if not all or almost all nets, still have enough insecticide to meet at least the WHO minimum threshold. So from that perspective, and again, that can vary as well. We also have settings where after 12 or 24 months, we're seeing some reduced efficacy of the insecticide. So the answer is it varies, but I will say that if you sum them all up, the physical durability of nets for the median survival is somewhere around 3 years.
Thank you, Sean. Our next question is from Guda Alemayehu. In declining malaria transmission in some countries and seasonal variation, the threat perception is falling. How can we sustain net care and use during this situation? Are there any unique SBCC approaches in this situation? Hannah?
Sure, thanks for that question, Guda. This is a good one, and one we've looked at in the context of Zanzibar in the past. I think the key for me in places where transmission is falling and that risk perception is also going down is to focus a lot of the SBC not only on the sort of malaria prevention benefits of net use, but also on non-malaria benefits of net use. So nets are great for keeping out cockroaches, rats, snakes, cats, other biting insects. Lots of annoying things that happen to you while you're sleeping can be prevented by a nice mosquito net. So I think boosting the profile of nets for helping you to achieve, a comfortable sleep free from nuisances. That good night's sleep then helps you feel rested in the morning, helps you be more productive. I think some of the selling points of nets don't need to focus on malaria at all. It's not that we want to drop that angle entirely, but we also want to help keep people using those nets when the malaria part is not as important. And those are some ways that we've tried and others have tried to help boost those rates of use in the dry season and in lower transmission places.
Great, thank you, Hannah. Our next question is from Ole Skogman, and his question is, what do you suggest to do to get higher protection of school children? Hannah?
To get higher protection of school children, Ole, thank you for your question. I think we would need to really consider the sleeping patterns of those school children and perhaps adjust some of the quantification in mass campaigns or other distribution strategies that would help them ensure that they do actually have a net to sleep under in the place that they would be using it. The other thing to do is to consider direct school-based distribution to school children, either as part of a multifaceted continuous distribution system or as a standalone approach to keep up ITN access throughout the country, which is what Tanzania is doing. So school-based distribution is nice because you can kind of quantify with existing enrollment data and get those nets out to those distribution points in a fairly logistically straightforward fashion. But that would be my advice. I think we have to meet school children where they are and meet those households where they are in terms of how they allocate those nets within the household.
Great, thank you. Our next question is from James Sekitulepo, and this is directed specifically to Hannah. From the results, it seems net use in urban areas and in the rich household, net use is low. What is your advice on continued mass LLIN campaign in these areas?
Thanks, James. That's a great question and one that I know that we've been wrestling with for a little while now. So not all urban areas are alike, and even in an urban area, quote unquote, there are people who are at high risk for malaria, even if the general parasitemia level is low. So I think on a case-by-case basis, you would ideally like to do some robust modeling about what would happen if you stopped doing mass campaigns, for example, in Lagos or Accra or Takoradi or, Dakar. It's challenging politically, as we know, to not do campaigns in those areas because there's a lot of voters there and a lot of politicians representing those voters. But I think we really need to focus on the evidence base for that. And with the modeling capabilities that we have now, I think it's an important question to try and assess, what would be the impact on malaria transmission, impact on malaria burden by not doing mass campaigns anymore in Lagos. I think that's probably answerable to a certain extent. Personally, I would not do a mass campaign in Lagos, but because the malaria is so low there and people have good access to treatment. Accra is a challenge because it's so spread out. Obviously, Lagos is too. But I think it's a case-by-case basis, and figuring out a way to target the households that do need nets within those urban areas is kind of the next stage of precision ITN delivery.
Thank you, Hannah. And our next, and I'm afraid our last question, given the time, is from Michael Humes. And this is in a similar vein. Hannah presented on a relationship between LLIN use and malaria preference by wealth quintile in some countries. Ghana and Nigeria, there seemed to be a strong relationship where wealthier families had less malaria and used their LLINs less. In other settings, such as the DRC, it was usage across all wealth quintiles. I'm curious how much of that relationship might be driven by housing improvements such as screens. DHS collects data on household structural elements such as screens, so they have looked at how much of this relationship might be driven by availability of improved household structures, specifically screens. For example, does that relationship become more noticeable in settings where differences in screens on a household is larger across wealth quintiles? Hannah.
Thanks. I love that question, and I'm excited to look more into the data on that. We have been trying to track which DHSs are collecting data on screens. I mean, they all collect roof and wall and floor material, but only a very few have really collected any information on mosquito, on screening of windows. I think that's an excellent hypothesis and one that we should look at further.
Great, thank you, Hannah. And I'm afraid we're going to have to end there. We could have devoted an entire webinar to each topic and spent more time discussing the remaining questions. However, I'm aware that we're running near the end of our allotted time, so I'd like to close. I would really like to thank Angela, Hannah, and Sean for their excellent and thought-provoking presentations today. And thanks to all of you who have dialed in from different parts of the world to join us. And thank you for your questions. And even for those that weren't answered, thanks for asking the questions. So just to recap, there are many more dimensions to net use, to nets than just net use. Data is available to help countries better target the populations that most need SBC, and promoting net care should be done more widely and intentionally. When it comes to net distribution, SBC should focus on promoting awareness of the distribution, that is the registration, availability of a new continuous distribution channel, and eligibility criteria. These key points and many more can be found in the ITN SBC Toolkit. The ITN SBC Toolkit is a one-stop shop resource for all aspects of net SBC. You can find it on the Health Compass on the vectorworks.org website. As I said earlier, we will send an email later today with the recording and the slide from today's webinar. Thank you so much for attending and have a wonderful day. Goodbye to all.
Thanks, Don. And any looming questions, we'll make sure to answer and send out in the notes. Thanks for all the thought-provoking questions, and thank you, Don, for doing a great job moderating. Thank you.
Pleasure.